Here we go. Okay. So we first started talking about the African American Civil Rights Movement with the court case Brown versus Board of Education. What did that court case decide? School segregation is illegal. So schools must desegregate. Now, this is going to, right, this is on the trend of racial justice. Right? Individual rights. Government protection. Okay. And this is going to do a couple things. First, it reversed a previous decision made by the Supreme Court. What was that court case it reversed? Because what did Plessy versus Ferguson say? Separate but equal. So this reverses Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, does this mean that the next day every school is desegregated and there's no more problems or anything? No. What do many cities and states begin to do? Yeah, what do they do to the public schools? Yeah, instead of actually desegregating, a lot of schools will temporarily close public schools instead of desegregating, instead of integrating. Right? Now, we talked about one example of the fight over school segregation with the Little Rock Nine. Remember, that was one of the high schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. They were going to integrate, and there was a crowd of people, right? What did the governor of Arkansas do? Yeah, National Guard tried to stop integration. So, what does President Eisenhower do? He sends in the army to enforce integration. Right? And they walked in the school. So he sent federal troops, U.S. Army soldiers, into Little Rock, Arkansas to enforce it because he said, in a battle between a state who doesn't want to integrate and the national government's decision in the Supreme Court, Brown versus Board, saying they have to, the national government must win. Okay, that's what Eisenhower says. Now, at the end of the year, what ended up happening to Central Little Rock or Little Rock Central High? Yeah, well, they closed the public school. Okay, so they closed the public high school at the end of the year. Efforts to integrate schools will continue throughout this time period, and this will be a battle that will continue. Now, in the fight for integration in other places, this is going to take a long time, and we talked about different strategies to do that, right? For example, we talked about boycotts. Where do we see a boycott? Yeah, where was that? Montgomery bus boycott. And who does it start off with? Rosa Parks. Who's going to help to organize the boycott and get people to carpool and get people where they need to go? Okay, so we have MLK and his group. What is his group called? No. SCLC. Remember, at this time, the SCLC is less confrontational. So boycott is not very confrontational, right? But it works, right? And there seems to be a divide amongst activists, especially amongst younger people. Younger people are saying, well, it worked with this boycott, but maybe we need to be more confrontational. And so young people will start forming groups to try to do that. So we'll get to it. So an example of this that is more confrontational but still peaceful are the sit-in movements. This is going to be done by young people. Does anyone remember where the first big sit-in movement was? Greensboro, North Carolina. Right? This is nonviolent. But it's more confrontational. And young people like that. So confrontational does not mean violent. Now, sit-ins will work in places like Greensboro, and so other groups will try to start this. Oh, I should say, what is the organization that the young people start after this? SNCC. Okay, SNCC. Now, SNCC and other groups like CORE will try to take in the successful sit-in movements here in Greensboro and try to do that with other things like the Freedom Rides. Right, where they go to a bus stop and that's supposed to be integrated, and they do a sit-in there, and they try to get it changed. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Eventually, though, with enough, remember there was multiple freedom rides that would spawn off this. The national government is going to enforce court decisions integrating bus stops and waiting rooms and restaurants at bus stops. So the SCLC sees that these more confrontational strategies are working, and so they begin to do this as well, right? We have, for example, the Birmingham and Project C. Where King is going to eventually get arrested. He writes his letter from Birmingham jail. And in it, he says a couple things. He defends civil disobedience, where civil disobedience is breaking an unjust law. He criticizes people who say, wait. He's criticizing them. We can't wait any longer. He says he doesn't need to be patient. They've been patient for years, for 340 years. He says our goal is integration and equal rights. He says this is part of a global change movement as people around the world are demanding more rights and more change. Now, eventually, later that summer, Martin Luther King Jr. and others will arrive in Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington. What's their goal in the March on Washington? What are they trying to get? Okay, they're trying to pressure Congress to pass a civil rights law. And it would take another year for them to actually do it. But what does the Civil Rights Act of 1964 do? This is a basic one we need to know. It outlaws segregation in public places. Okay, so the fighting for integration that's been going on since the Civil War, they've gotten rid of those laws. Now they turn to what? So remember? Big issue for the next year? It is voting. Okay, so they go for voting. So we have things like the Freedom Summer, where they're trying to get people registered to vote. There's the Selma March, where they're protesting voting restrictions and literacy tests and poll taxes. And eventually it leads to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So after 1965, the question is, well, what do we do next? We've gotten rid of these segregation laws. We've got rid of these voting restrictions. But that doesn't mean that everything has been solved in society. There's still a lot of problems. So many people, activists will turn to de facto segregation. That's segregation that happens because of people's choices, the actions of people, not necessarily a law. For example, we talked about in the 1950s and 60s how realtors would not show homes to Black families in the suburbs. Now, there are some laws that are going to create white flights, homogenous suburbs, but in a lot of cases, it's not because of laws, it's because of individual action. That's led to segregation. So how do you change that? How do you get rid of it? That's going to become a big debate. And so that's where they were protesting against voting restrictions. And so there's a couple people that we talked about, like Malcolm X. Malcolm X believes he does not agree with King or the nonviolent direct action plan. He believes in using violence in self-defense. He does not think that integration should be a goal of the civil rights movement. For most of his time speaking, he does not believe that if white and Black people are put together, that would mean African Americans will have more opportunities or more rights. And so if it was up to him, he would separate so that African Americans could have control over the communities, control over businesses, control over politics. Now, where he does agree with King, as he does think this is part of a global change movement, in that African Americans and people of African descent from other countries, people in Africa, that can organize together to have more power. Many critics will say that Malcolm X is a radical leftist. Now, we talked about a couple other examples of people who had differing opinions on how to fight for equal rights. Like we talked about the Black Panther Party. Right? They're going to fight for change. even after the laws are passed? Right? Just because these laws have been passed does not mean everything is happy and there's no problems. And one of the things groups like the Black Panthers and Malcolm X are going to be upset by is that after these laws, many politicians are kind of like, okay, we did it. Like, we're done. We don't need to worry about civil rights anymore. Including Democratic leaders who were big into trying to change the Civil Rights Act. And they said, well, why are you just okay with things staying the way they are? They're upset at politicians who don't care about actually making meaningful change in the future, that are fine with just the status quo of like, okay, we passed the Civil Rights Act. That's all we need to do. And many activists will say, no, there's more work to be done. This is more difficult work. It's more ambiguous work, but there's still work to be done. Yeah, again, they are going to agree with Malcolm X and Black Panthers that integration is not necessarily a goal. The integration is not the number one thing that African Americans need. Part of the Black Power movement. That African Americans have more political, social, and economic power in their communities. Now, we do see the government look into this in what's called the Kerner Commission. Remember, this starts because of a lot of racial violence in big cities. Because politicians are like, wait, we passed all these laws. Why is there still so much violence? And the Kerner Commission will say, basically, it's because there's still de facto segregation. And that those racial policies are long lasting. Just because the law goes away doesn't mean that everything is fixed right after that. It doesn't mean that discrimination just disappears. Racial policies have long lasting effects beyond even when the law is gone. And then at the end of our chapter, we talked about a couple different examples of how groups of people are going to learn from the African American Civil Rights Movement to also fight for other groups, like Cesar Chavez and the UFW, the United Farm Workers. They're going to try to use their labor as a source of change. Do you remember what they do? Yeah, they do a grape strike. Many of these workers are working on grape vineyards, and so they go on strike, and all these grapes rot in the hot sun, and it affects not only table grapes, but jams and jellies and wine and all these different things. We talked about the American Indian Movement, or AIM. And AIM is going to take more violent. Oops. Grape strike works, yeah. AIM takes more violent options, like they take over Alcatraz and Wounded Knee, South Dakota. And in the 1960s, when this happens, the violent strategies are not well received by other Americans. those are not. Anything that turns people off more than going to it. Okay. 2 minutes left. Any questions about chapter 26? Anybody? Or from your side guys from that time?
Can you, what is freedom summary?
Freedom Summer is when they were trying to register to vote.
Oh, really?
Right. As a result of these restrictions prevent black people from voting. And so they decided, okay, we're gonna try to use our power to get people registered, but there's so many restrictions, it's very difficult. And that's when they pushed for like a march from Selma to Montgomery to get that state. Voting Rights Act.
Mr. Butler.
Yep, I just need to get something in the grade book, right, so.